Welcome, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Welcome to the Brattleboro Democracy Forum. First Monday of every month here at the Stroling of the Heifers, and also the first Monday of the month at the Brooks Memorial Library at 7 o'clock. Tim will be presenting there tonight on the subject of a history of voter exclusion and suppression in the United States. So we hope we'll see some of you there. I'm really pleased to have Tim and Nick and Neil here to present on this unusual subject, Trump and malignant narcissism. So, thanks very much, guys.
Welcome. Hello, I'm Neil Senior, child adult psychiatrist. I never diagnose people unless I interview them face to face. On my right is a true narcissist. So there are three handouts. There's one that's this handout here, which is the one we'll begin with. And oh, sorry, they're on the back table there. What's left? So essentially, this is a quick preamble about narcissistic personality disorder, and this is a discussion about the development of personality. So the quick and dirty is that when we are all born, we all have a temperament. And the temperament, there's three types of temperament. There's three types of temperament. Easy kids who are easy to get along with, difficult kids, and slow to warm up kids. And that is all genetic / neurobiological. That all make sense? And then we add some environment stuff of various sorts. Nobody really knows for sure what the mix is. Probably 70% genetic, 30% environment leads to personality. Okay so far? So personality is how we relate to each other. And there's lots of definitions. My definition is a good personality, good, is a personality that achieves mutual relationships. The ability to get along with people is a measure of your personality. And people who get along in a mutual way, I regard as having a good, quote-unquote, good personality. But there are personality disorders, and there's three clusters. The way it's thought about is there's three clusters. And it's A, B, and C. And cluster A are the odd eccentric types who are schizoid, schizotypal, and paranoid. These are basically people who are internalized, faced inwards, don't really get along with people, avoid hermits perhaps, maybe one example. Cluster B are the dramatic and unpredictable, and that includes narcissistic, borderline, sociopathic, and histrionic. And that's the group we're going to kind of focus in on today. And then cluster C are the anxious, fearful personalities, avoidant, dependent, obsessive, compulsive. And the point of this is that personality essentially is pretty much immutable. I mean, you can go through extended periods of therapy, but these things essentially are what we carry. And I would suggest to each of you, if you think about wanting to change your personality, have a go at it and see how it works out. It just doesn't go very well. And so these things are sort of the core. Now, people have stuff laid on top of that, right? I mean, anyone in this group can become depressed or schizophrenic or whatever, which essentially are treatable conditions. But these are the core disorders, the personality disorders, and the way people go through life. So, and then what's character? Well, character is, I regard character as somebody who's trustworthy. So anybody in any of these groups can be trustworthy, but I think character is different to personality. And so when we look at somebody, we're looking at their personality, how they relate to people, and then the next question for me is, are they trustworthy and how they approach the world? So you could have a really nice personality, friendly, get along, amicable, and then be stealing from you. I wouldn't regard that as a very good character. And then the last comment is folie à deux. Folie à deux is this, it's not folie à trois, though we like to think that. Folie à deux is when one person's individual psychopathology has a profound impact on another's. And it's thought of in terms of psychotic illness, that there's, that's what I've said, there is shared madness. But it's bigger than that. I think that folie à deux is the concept of, the question is, how does somebody who has an unhealthy personality attract so many followers? And it's conceptualized in terms, it's obviously not infectious or contagious, but it is true that when you have a strong personality, and especially a strong personality disorder, it's relatively, it does occur that other people of similar ilk are attracted. And this makes it much more difficult, much more dangerous to deal with. Okay? Does that make sense? So it's not just the personality disorder of the individual to be concerned about, it's the personality disorder of the cohort of friends, hangers-on, lawyers, psychiatrists. So a disorder, it's worth saying, a disorder is when personality doesn't go well. So that's, I should have said that. There's normal personality, things go well, and then there's personality that doesn't go so well. And these are the three clusters we think about. Okay, so that's that. The second page looks like that. And I had to cut up an article so the heading was at the bottom, which is the way my day has gone. And what's important about this is these are unconscious mechanisms that we all use to some degree to deal with anxiety. So, and there's thought to be 7 of them that are significant, and they tend to be unhealthy. I mean, we all do it, right? We have we have a car accident, we blame the other driver when it's actually us who are speeding. But these things are unconscious, and they come out in relationships in a way that interferes with the relationship. And so there's projection. And what that is putting stuff onto others that are really about you. Make sense? That's fairly straightforward. Rationalization is using intellectual, I mean, you can read these in further detail, I'm just quickly going through them. But rationalization is using using your intellect to rationalize, explaining what you're doing. You have a bad boss, you rationalize stealing from them. Right? It seems to be a totally reasonable thing to do. Intellectualization is thinking about things logically or coldly without emotion. This is a really big problem. Reaction formation is doing the opposite to what you'd really like to do. So you go out of the example given, you go out of your way to be really nice to somebody that you don't like. Regression is turning to more childlike forms of defense. Repression is keeping an experience out of consciousness. And denial is refusing to accept that something exists or happens. And denial and repression and projection tend to be real, sort of, if you will, primitive defense mechanisms that we use to get through the day. And the point of this is frequent use of these kind of mechanisms. And they're worth listening for when you hear somebody speak about whatever they're talking about in terms of what a wonderful job they're doing, and thinking about these sort of concepts as a way to understand what you're listening to. So that's that page. And then the last page, it looks like that. And this is narcissistic personality disorder, which I think is really highly relevant to this discussion, because the discussion is really about, we're going to get into further, is malignant narcissism. And so this is what just plain old narcissistic personality disorder looks like. And if you go down the list, some things might catch your eye and be relevant to some of the stuff you've been hearing. Exaggerated sense of self-importance, sense of entitlement, Expect to be recognized as superior even without achievements, exaggerate achievements, be preoccupied with fantasies about success, believe you're superior, and only associate with equally special people, which is what I'm doing up here. Monopolize conversations and look down on people they perceive as inferior, which is what I'm doing up here. Expect special favors, unquestioning compliance with expectations. I mean, this is an unbelievable list, which I don't know, when I watch or listen, I'm kind of going, it's the whole list.
You have somebody in mind?
It kind of trumps what I'm trying to think about. Take advantage of others to get what you want. Fancy that. Have an inability, unwillingness to recognize needs and feelings of others, be envious of others, believe that others envy them, behave in an arrogant or haughty manner. I could shoot somebody on 4th Avenue. Insist on having the best of everything, gold-plated toilet. And so what happens when you have that kind of function on the back page, on the back side? They become impatient or angry when they don't receive special treatment. I'm going to fight, get that ambassador out of there. Have significant interpersonal problems and feel easily slighted, react with rage or contempt and try to belittle the other person to make themselves feel superior. Have difficulty regulating emotions and behavior. Experience major problems dealing with stress, adapting to change, feel depressed and moody, and have secret feelings of insecurity, shame, vulnerability, and humiliation. So that is narcissistic personality, and then we have malignant narcissistic personality. Malignant narcissistic personality is on this sheet, but without all the drawing on it, which includes, this is very bad narcissism. I mean, it's fair to say we all have narcissistic thoughts, right? We all care about ourselves and the world. I mean, don't get me wrong. Narcissism per se is a healthy part of getting through the day. But when it disrupts relationships, things, that's not so good. And then when it gets to this level, when you have sadistic behaviors, families being separated, proactive manipulation, antisocial behavior, hypersensitivity to criticism, paranoia, lack of empathy, failure to accept responsibility, need for attention, delusions of grandeur. Now, a delusion is a thought that has no basis in fact. Okay, so that's a pretty important thing. That's really getting, if you will, along the line of psychopathology. Delusion, you don't want to have delusions. They're not good. Try not to have those. Envy and egocentricity. Tweet, tweet. Tweet, tweet. Yeah, tweet, tweet, right. There you go. So the concept that we're going to talk about today, having taken you through this preamble, is talking about malignant narcissism as an end stage, if you will, of narcissism. So if you think about it, we're all narcissistic in a healthy way. Everybody in this room. Then there are some of us who have narcissistic personality disorder, which disrupts interpersonal relationships, and then there's malignant narcissism, malignant narcissism, where you take active steps to destroy relationships. Okay, so that's the concept. Any questions about this? Yes?
People that have a personality disorder, is that something they're hardwired with, or is that acquired?
Well, it seems as if for those of us who've had 2 children, we realize that the kids are different even though we have raised them in the same environment. And so there's an aspect of personality that's hardwired, and then there's acquired personality components. And the thought is, I'm making it up because I don't think we really know. Do we know? I don't think we know.
There's some good theories, but for some of them.
Second?
There's some theories about interactions if you come in with emotional vulnerability and liability, and then you're raised in a somewhat chaotic unstable environment, that's likely to mesh into.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Stephen Benoit, I'm a clinical psychologist,
Right.
and I'm not sitting up there.
So a guess, a total guess is that 70% hardwired, 30% environment. And there's an interaction that occurs between the environment and the hardwiring. That, you know, so somewhere in the middle there's an overlap of both those components. Does that help?
Just like personality.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Assuming a malignant narcissist survives to adulthood, do they burn out?
It's a really interesting question, and the answer is sometimes.
Could you repeat the question?
The question is, if you're a malignant narcissist, does it burn out as you age? And my sense of it is that there are certainly, I mean, it gets complicated, I think, because there's some components of malignant narcissism that are treatable. And so what I see in my office is I see, narcissistic adolescents who are causing mayhem, who calm down as they age. I think that's true, but not everybody does. But again, another way to think about it is that people who end up in jail, typically, and this is, I mean, there's obviously drug use, leaving that aside, bad behavior, thinking just about bad behavior. People who end up in jail tend to be of the age 20 to 40, and then they don't seem to stay in jail. And so the question is, do they finally learn how to behave themselves, or has this internal hard wiring burn itself out? So the answer is sometimes. I think it's unusual to have a 77-year-old having these kind of significant issues. So it's
74, I think it is.
74. Yeah. But I don't treat older folks, and maybe it manifests in different ways. But I think that it's a fair comment that lots of psychopathology tends to diminish as we age. That's fair. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Anne McDonald. I have a private practice in psychotherapy and was a clinical social worker for many years.
Hi.
And the question that I have really is what is malignant is
Could
really...
you speak up a bit?
Oh, the question I have is, or statement, is that malignant/dangerous is what we're looking at now. And what, I mean, we think back to history, we think of people like Stalin or Hitler or any one of another banana republic dictators who probably had this kind of disorder. But how does it stop? If we cannot, if he is so far, we know who he is so far gone in his narcissism, and that how, if the Constitution doesn't stop it, what will stop him?
Right. You understand the question? And I think the answer, in the broader sense, in society, people with personality disorders mostly get through life without having external limits put on them, right? I mean, some numbers of people just get through life causing mayhem, and nothing happens really. But there's another group where there's external structure that limits them. So, for instance, prison is an example where bad people may end up incarcerated as a way to try to manage them. But essentially the issue you're raising is, the concept, the sort of naive concept we all have is checks and balances, and where are the checks and balances? And one of the things that a malignant narcissist can do is proactive manipulation. So what would be an example of proactive manipulation if you were in charge of everything would be buying people off either with fear, intimidation, or cash, right? And so then this gets to a folie à deux issue, which is how is it that people, well-meaning people who care about, for example, the Constitution, how is it they flip? And what is it that causes them to then line up behind somebody who's behaving very badly? And I don't think there's a single answer to that, but it does feel from the outside that there are, the checks and quote-unquote checks and balances we currently have are simply not working. And so how do we stop that? The only choice we have is a broken voting system, which 7 o'clock tonight we'll hear more about. But essentially that's what we have, right? And one of the other choice is violence. Look, some, you know, the other countries, they utilize violence to deal with this. There's nobody here suggesting we do that. We have a mechanism for dealing with this, and it's voting in November.
Because of the circumstances that we are now in, I realize we have HIPAA laws and they're quite strict. But should we start thinking about having a requirement for a presidential candidate to pass a mental stability test?
Well, there you have something I like.
Can you repeat that? Can you repeat?
Yeah, the question is, should there be a mental health evaluation prior to running for office for the president? But one thing, I'll certainly get to you in a second. One thing I would like to see is I think everybody in politics should have a security check. I mean, let's just start with it. Everybody who works in the government has to have a security check. Why in the world can somebody run for office without having a security check? And I will bet you $1 that the individual that we're now sort of alluding to would have failed a security check and would not have been allowed to run, leaving aside the mental health issues. The mental, you know, the mental health issue evaluation business, and there's a woman named Brandy Lee who's pushing for, you know, a 72-hour hold, that kind of thing. Yes. By the way, in Vermont, you cannot do that. That's not part of the law in Vermont, but it is in some states. That's a, you know, that's a reasonable disorder. The difficulty is we're probably talking about a character or a personality dysfunction, and we're not talking about necessary. I mean, I happen to think there's some individuals who have malignant narcissism who also have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They're very impulsive. They blurt stuff out. They don't think before they speak, including me. They're very inattentive. I mean, it would be totally reasonable to consider a course of medication for ADHD. I think. Will it take care of the personality? No. But it might help people keep their mouth shut. You know, then that's an important issue. It's just so much mayhem is caused by not thinking before one speaks. But your answer is, I think that's further along. It would be easier to pass a security screen than it would be to pass a mental health.
I hear people talking about the laws. I hear people talking about individual pathology, but what about the 50% or so of the population that supports somebody like that? It's a very sick society and an undereducated society, such that people don't learn civics, they don't learn history. Nowadays, they're not even learning a foreign language. They don't understand other cultures. It's a setup for somebody like.
Well, let's segue into what we're going to do.
Yeah, well, I'll just say that's why I threw folie à deux on this. That's why I put folie à deux on the piece of paper. There's something that happens with powerful individuals that causes other people to line up behind them. And we all don't mind it if the person's good and kind and caring and like compassionate, but you are absolutely right that people line up behind bad people in large numbers. Look at Brexit. There's another really good contemporary example. So anyway, it's...
Okay, this may be a good transition from the psychiatric for Nick and I. We're both historians and political scientists. I've been taught for 39 years and political activist since the 60s. And when we conceptualize this presentation, if you have that list there One is the malignant narcissism, the other one is characteristics of fascism. You could put in authoritarianism, I don't care, I don't want to argue about language. But if you if you compare those two lists, they're striking. And so what Nick and I wanted to do was take this list from Neil's perspective and then see how it fits into the behavior of our president. For any of you who know us, know where we stand in terms of our critique of the president. I think he's the most dangerous leader we've ever seen in the history of our country, and certainly in terms of president. And so I don't want to be anything but real clear on that as you listen to some of my remarks. So what we wanted to do is we decided we'd pick out a few of the narcissistic characteristics and then apply them to the second list. So I picked up on, in terms of the second list, I was talking about sadism and paranoia. And I think there's abundant evidence of such that we're seeing displayed with this president. And so I just wanted to, just to put a finer point on some of those. Feel free to join in and add to this as a conversation. I would love to have more perspectives on that. So let me start with sadism. One is a disdain for human rights. I mean, is it hard for us to figure out his views on immigrants? Is it hard to us to figure out his views on minorities? We've never heard or seen such behavior. Now, there may have been, maybe Nixon or some other leaders harbored those views, but pretty much they kept it to themselves or to their own internal policies. Cutting massive cuts to food stamps, housing, environmental protection, kids in cages, kids being separated from their parents. What civilized person would want that to be happening in our name?
A friend of mine just came back from the border.
Yes.
And she was telling me that they keep the temperature in those cages at 45 degrees.
Oh my God.
So that nobody gets comfortable. I mean, that's sadism,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Yes. So that's what we're talking. Yes, go ahead.
And individually, I think of the reporter, the disabled reporter, that the cage is a mass sadistic move, but picking on someone who didn't speak right or...
It's just, it is so jarring, and it is still jarring to me personally. Even though we are, I'm never going to allow this to be normalized. None of us, I hope, are going to allow this to be normalized. Whereas it seems like the Republican cult party, it's a cult, it seems to be normalizing it. And so, pardon me for my strong points of view.
I think the other thing that takes it to the next level is he thinks it's funny. And I think that's a big leap from doing something wrong to actually think what you're doing is kind of funny.
Right.
It's totally,
Yes.
Because there's nothing funny
Yeah.
about all the things
Yeah.
you're doing with policies and making fun of people,
Yeah.
which is what you were saying perfectly,
So the constant demonizing, humiliating, degrading ethnics, any non-white and the poor. I'm not going to apologize for quoting the president, but can you imagine, we are now excluding, according to NPR, 25% of the people from shithole countries from coming into this country. That's the data for this new travel ban that's added, 6 more countries? 25% of the people in Africa would be, right up front now, cannot come into this country. That, to me, is sadistic pieces of behavior. And so you demonize them, and so immigrants are rapists and drug dealers and gang members. They're all are. All right? Racism, I gotta watch my time here. Okay, gotta tell time first. Okay, Nick, why don't you take over for one?
Okay. One thing that I think that I want to reinforce is when we started, the question of what causes someone who has malignant narcissism to be able to attract followers. Right? And Neil was talking about the defense mechanisms that, and so that's, I think, this sheet here, that people automatically recur to in the face of threats. And it's pretty well known that, or we accept, I think, is that economic insecurity, the absolute wealth divide that has occurred in the last 40 years is a primary cause of great social insecurity across the board. And it feeds the ability of somebody to use that insecurity to divide and attract at the same time. Divide and then use this kind of malignant, narcissistic disdain for human rights and use of scapegoats, as in the Mexicans who are drug-dealing rapists, et cetera, to sort of assuage the fears, right, of the population that is feeling this great insecurity based on their economic situation, the destruction of unions, and the whole of the middle class over these last 40 years also leads to a loss of self-respect and general respect. And so there's a huge portion of our population in the United States that is ripe, we'll call it, for this kind of dynamic to take place. And what's so astounding to us all sitting here is how extreme this particular individual has been able to act and have a complete success. I was reading a thing today, I just want to read this. A guy who was a major media fellow in Iowa wrote an article in the New York Times this morning. He's been, he's well regarded. He gets into all of the events, and he went to Trump's rally on Thursday. And this is what he wrote: Trump wove truths, half-truths, hyperbole, exaggeration, and lies seamlessly into a vast, swirling reality that swept the audience along in an energizing experience as thrilling as an overtime win at the Super Bowl. And we know that's true. Anybody who, we know that's absolutely true. And that's the way that people are responding. Because this is feeding those insecurities and allowing them this great projection. And Trump supporters don't care about impeachment, the lies, any of it. As one man told me in the concession line before the event, he doesn't care what Trump does, legal or not, because he knows Trump has his back. Yeah.
Well, what you're saying, I understand how it applies to a lot of people that are needy and perhaps don't read the paper every day or look anything up for facts. What about the senators? I mean, most of his people have money issues where they're dealing with Russia. They're the same as he is, basically.
But Democrats did nothing to change the vicious cycle of wealth and power. Excuse me for interrupting. This is Robert Reich, writing in The Guardian 3 days ago, describing why we're all guilty, Democrats and Republicans, and we haven't stood up ourselves for the middle class. Yes?
I'd like to stop and back up 3 sentences, because he's got my back. Would you please, any of you, identify very clearly what that means? What is he thinking? He has my back. In what way does Trump have his back, please?
To the degree that I was in the analysis I just gave, he has his back. He will continue to feed the fears that enable that kind of projection.
Well, yeah, but I mean to say that this guy, Trump, is behind me because he's feeding my fear. No, is he feeding his economic pocketbook? What is he? It doesn't matter.
That's what I would say, is that the emotional comfort from being able to use these psychological projections and defense mechanisms that come fairly unconsciously, that come kind of naturally when we're feeling threat. That's enough
So he has my back really means nothing.
It does not mean anything. And I think what's phenomenal in the last 20 years or so is that how we have gotten, or this system, or the people in power have gotten people to vote against their own self-interest.
Yeah.
In a very conscious,
Yeah.
open-eyed way. I mean, it is still head-rattling to be thinking about. And I think where that springs from is what we've created is a society of alienated people who don't see what our system does for them. And if you look at Trump supporters, it's like going to a Nuremberg rally, and I'm almost old enough to have been there, is that they feel so alienated from the system, both not only psychologically, but also, look at all those minorities are getting ahead. They're getting in front of me in the line. There's the imagery of L.A. Hochschild's book on talking about this. And she says, well, it's like society's this one long line, and then the blacks move up, and then the Native Americans move up, but I'm still here, white, working class, lower class, I'm still in the same place. But the government's working for them, they're not working for me. And so I think that lends itself to that kind of alienation that then becomes, you're vulnerable to those kinds of messages. It's a classic demagogic move. It is textbook demagogy.
Which there is a book at everyone's books called The German War, which is thousands of interviews and everything with everybody from the scientists, from the scholars, from the people that supported Trump, the Jews that voted for Hitler, and the people that did experiments and all of that. And it explains how coming out of World War I, and you couldn't buy a loaf of bread with a bushel of, and it's a fabulous read, because ordinary people like me are saying how they got swept along into this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Neil, I had a question for you. Sure. How do you, what's the symptomatology that differentiates narcissistic personality disorder from antisocial?
Well, it's essentially, as I said earlier, everybody has narcissistic features, but narcissistic personality disorder is primarily involved in themselves, and the antisocial person is somebody who's doing some sort of destructive acts in the environment against other people. But there's a big overlap. I mean, these things are not freestanding. Yeah, they're not, but they're not for anybody. I mean, there are narcissists with antisocial characteristics. Is that help? Yeah. The one thing I'm going to say right apropos what you just said is CBS did this thing with a pumpkin pie this week, where they sliced up a pumpkin pie into 10 pieces, and they had people with plates. The very rich, how many slices do they get? The extremely poor, how many do they get? And they asked the public in a mall, and guess what? Nobody could get it right. But essentially what it is 9 pieces go to the extremely rich, one piece goes to the rich, a few crumbs go to the middle class, and the poor get nothing. And it was a visualization of an intellectual, it's out there all the time, and people read about it, but these people were horrified to see it visually. And part of the problem is, I think, apropos of this issue, is we present stuff in complicated ways. And we make it difficult. People, they don't really want us to understand what's going on. I mean, honestly. And so, I'm really glad that we got Kansas City back into Missouri today. That was anyway, I'm sorry.
I'd like to make a comment about, if you think about that sequence of statements, I don't care about the lies, I don't care about the nepotism, I don't care about, why would you think the next thing that was coming would be rational? There's nothing rational about that line of thought. So there is no because that could rationalize those preceding statements. So it has to be a deeply emotional, irrational thing that is allowing somebody to come to that conclusion.
And then to jump on that, if the New York Times is counting the number of lies you tell since you become president, we're up to 14,000. How can you believe anything? 16,000. Yeah, how can you believe anything?
That was yesterday.
Right? It's just like, it's rife with problems. So
It reminds me of the old joke about the Vermonter who was known to be a liar. And he said, well, how'd you know that? I said, well, he had to get somebody else to call his cows in to pasture.
And so, you know, we spend a lot of our time ourselves not sharing the Trumpian ugly malignancy, but trying to laugh our way through it and see see something in between the lines. And so there are moments that I think we really should continue to pay attention to. I think that October 7th of last year was the day that Trump, out of the blue, pulled U.S. support out of Syria and left the Kurds to fight against the Syrians, the Turkish, and the Russians. Now, there's nobody in the American military command structure would have ever supported or approved of that decision. So where did that come from? This is where the danger zone becomes really clear, and it's not like we don't need, or it's not like we do need more reason to hate or to at least oppose Trump. You wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say that the recent peace plan in Israel-Palestine, that Jason, whatever the hell his name is, Kushner, he solved it. No Palestinians had anything to do with that document. And now this is where it gets international.
Right.
Syria is certainly being just as dangerous.
So it quickly comes back to character, which is somebody a good character in my mind is trustworthy. And what you just said is these are not trustworthy decisions. It's bigger than personality.
And so we have that list here of the malignant narcissism. Egocentricity is the last on the line. Clearly, whatever his decision is fused around egocentricity, but you can't help but also take into consideration the real possibility that Putin suggested this. Right. Because it falls completely in line with Putin's foreign strategy. Right. There's that. But in response, we know that he was on edge, or he knew he was walking a pretty tight line, because his response when correspondents said, well, what if the Turks come in and slaughter the Kurds, which of course was their intention, and that's just what they did. He said, if Turkey does anything that I, in my great and unmatched wisdom, consider to be off limits, I will totally destroy and obliterate the economy of Turkey. I've done it before.
You actually said that, didn't you?
No, that's a quote. That's an absolute quote from the New York Times on the 8th of November.
Ann's got a question back there.
Thought, I'm not sure how it becomes a question, but that'll be obvious. One of the things that concerns me, even about this discussion, is it's all about one single individual who has risen to a point of doing very bad things. But behind that individual is a proof that Hillary Clinton was right. There has been, for 40 plus years, a vast right-wing conspiracy. And Fox News has been training vast swaths of America that lying is okay for 25 years or more, whatever they've done. And I don't know how we get to the narcissistic parameters of one individual and how it relates to all of that comes behind. And we do with the Steve Bannons of this world, who are promulgating this worldwide. Is he a narcissist? I don't know. So I really am not sure. My real question is, where do we go from here? Just getting Trump out of office is not enough.
Let me just respond to your point about, yes, we shouldn't just be looking at one person. He is a symptom of the system that has been emerging for years. Yes. You have a whole political party that I would argue doesn't function as a political party anymore. I mean, you think about even the days of Nixon and Watergate and the Republican leadership, like Howard Baker and Cohen from Maine, and even Ed Dirksen and people, and Barry Goldwater. They were the ones that convinced Nixon to resign. They were Republicans. They were leaders of the Republican Party. we don't see any kind of diversity, plurality like that. It's not. It's a, you know, in its extreme, I would call it a cult. And they're fearful. Those minions in the Senate and in the House, are fearful that the wrath of the tweet will be visited upon them, and then because of that connection with the base, that's their hyper concern is. I think it's a very simplistic and dangerous situation that we've gotten ourselves into.
I would add on to never forget that the real cause underlying here is this concentration of wealth that has occurred over the last 50 years, combined with the destruction of the middle class. So it's follow the money, which is, you know, the old Nixon thing. And where is really the money? The money's in the fossil fuel industry. That's the spine of all money. And we're all here knowing that. And the fossil fuel industry is also the spine of the military-industrial complex. Each needs the other. One defends the other. You can't have jets without the oil. You can't have oil without the jets getting it from Saudi Arabia or wherever, Iraq, etc. So we are in a system that depends upon the acquisition of wealth by way of controlling oil and then lying about it completely to ourselves, to our body politic. It's illegal for you to know the budget of the CIA. It's illegal. You'd be a traitor if you knew it. What is that?
In the 2016 election, it was 1/4% or the ones who gave 40% of the money for campaigns. 1/10 of 1% gave 40% of the money for political campaigns in 2016. Which is about 23,000 people.
Which brings me back to defense mechanism. Wait, and you know, listening to this, what you've got going on is rationalization and intellectualization and repression. Essentially where basically, this is good for the country, there's nothing bad about this, I'll just give my money to the people that are, you know, burning the fossil fuels. And that's the sort of mechanism that's worth thinking about. I mean, I'm trying to think about what's below the surface in terms of why do people act this way? Why do people who are Enron employees or whatever it is act the way they do? And they do it because they've basically figured out a mechanism internally to rationalize that what they're doing is for the good of the country and for the good of themselves.
There was that Bush, the small Bush shrub, I like to call him, advisor, I can't remember, you guys might remember, who said at one point when a reporter was saying, well, what about the people? What about the, you know, the process, the procedure, the government, democracy? Said, you don't understand. This is not a democracy anymore. This is an empire. And when you get around to figuring out what happened today, it'll be different tomorrow. So that the mindset, the rationalization, the intellectualization at that top, for that 60% of the US government that runs off of the Pentagon budget, most of which we're not allowed to know, what are they thinking? They're not thinking about representing us. They're thinking about running an empire that maintains itself. So when we talk about what we have to do, the same thing that happened, which has created this situation, which is massive dislocation of a middle class into the upper class, the robbery of our working classes into the upper class, we have to reverse it. I mean, there's just no other way to heal the men's, and we'd like not to have to do it with pain, but a lot of people are feeling the pain right now. Yeah, Kate.
That's what bothers me about you, that he's of the 1%, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
And so if he got nominated and then became president, would it be just more of the same?
To a degree, I believe.
There's a whole dynamic I don't hear being addressed at all, which is the suppression of women. And that, I think, surpasses any of the other suppressions because it is so internalized in the culture, and I think it's been especially done so by the three Abrahamic religions. Thank God I wasn't born a woman and all of those things. It's invisible in the culture, or virtually invisible.
So,
In terms of sexism specifically, that has been determined. A recent study, Public Opinion Quarterly, 2019, did a study on Trump's sexism. He's a serial sexist, as we know, and that sexism is a powerful predictor of who would vote for Trump. And what he has done is taken that concept, that reality, and clearly his Breitbart type advisors are feeding him information on this, is that it makes it easier. And if you look at the use of the language of people in Congress today, particularly Republicans, that they are more willing to use sexist language than they have in years. It has opened up a permission. It's widened the gap of what the field of play for sexism to actually be verbalized and in many ways acted upon.
So here's one of my theories I should keep to myself. There's a concept floating around involving white supremacists, which is incel. And incel is involuntary celibates. And there's these young men who are out there complaining that they're not getting laid. And it's involuntary because women are withholding themselves from these men. Right? You got this concept? And so this is true. And so the shooting in Toronto recently, where there were 10 people shot, the guy was an incel protagonist. And so that's the backstory. My fantasy, I've not examined this gentleman, but I think one of our problems is that he has this individual who's in charge has had a long history of abusing women. He's had a long history of paying for sex. He's had a long history of, multiple relationships. And now he's in the White House. He doesn't have access to any of that. And I think what's happening, if you believe Freud that everything is sex and aggression, this is my fantasy. My fantasy is that this guy's not getting enough sex, and it's popping out as aggression. And that's partly why it appears to be getting worse and worse and worse. I think sex is a really big part of the gentleman who's running this country. And he does not have healthy relationships. He's abusive. This is clearly documented. And so I just throw that out there for you to ponder.
You don't think he's getting women in the side door anytime he wants?
Like John Kennedy? I think he's being watched. I don't know, but I think he's being watched to a degree that's probably not happening.
Well, now.
There you go. There goes some hands up.
Not to change the
about 4 hands
subject,
here.
there's a lot I could say.
How about, yes.
All of this doesn't really explain the irresponsibility of the people that are following him. Why is it that in the last 30, 40 years that the ability of people in positions of power to look forward the way they did following the Second World War, to understand that bringing the vanquished to a positive position is good for themselves as well as for the nations themselves. But the whole European Union movement that was done by people that were in the upper 1%, but with a sense of responsibility, where you don't see that at all these days. You saw it change in the 60s when a lot of younger people went into the industries, were sort of taken over by the people that came into the top and worried only about the bottom line instead of the responsibility of the product or the office in which they were working.
I would say, without being too glib, that it's in part it's an expression of the evolution of corporate capitalism. That kind of behavior is rewarded in a capitalist system. It makes, quote, sense for a capitalist to do that because they're rewarded. And they are going to do whatever they can to keep whatever they have and expand on that.
So Tim, if we call that the empire, were Bernie Sanders to be elected, how would he and could he in any way challenge this empire?
There are many formulas there. None of them are easy. The first thing I would do if I was Bernie's advisor anymore, and I'm not, is that I would change the campaign finance system. Get rid of that, make it, democratize it, nationalize the voting process, get rid of the caucuses, get rid of politicized secretaries of state who control the electoral process. That to me is number one, and maybe it's simplistic. There's a lot more that has to be done. One, if I had my way, it would be, I'm an old, unreconstructed Marxist, is we've got to get rid of capitalism. That's not realistic. That's not an answer. So if I had to choose one major step right now in reform, it would be the campaign finances. And I'd love to have people come to the talk tonight at 7.
I agree with you. I'm just wondering, can one individual, even if it were someone of that ilk, take on this empire establishment and get something like that to happen?
Yeah. But that's when Bernie walks into the White House, it will only have happened because he would have, by that time, and he already has it in hand and he's building on it, a social movement that's built of all classes and races, of millions of people who will be willing to get into the street in an hour's notice, and only then can the Wall Street and the 1% feel the reality of the rage that's coming at them.
And they're young.
And that's
They're
hopeful.
young.
That is very
And they're
hopeful.
young, and they also see climate change as their biggest threat.
That's why and one of the reasons why I still am an optimist, I have to be in my chosen field. So, yes, Don.
I think the other thing is that through the past generations, people feel very disassociated from the government, and they don't expect from the government what they would expect from their child, their husband, their wife, and basic moral code, right? And they just like, oh, those are politicians, like they're, that pack of meat that says doesn't come from an animal, and I think they've done it because it's their way of protecting themselves because it's so awful. But I think that that's like a human trait, right, to protect yourself. But I think that it's led to the situation we're in right now, where people are like, well, those guys are always corrupt. Those guys are always like this kind of blanket statement, and saying we can't do anything about it. And so, but if anyone had Trump as their parent running their business, which he's doing, he's running the country.
Yeah.
People wouldn't accept it.
I would say that the power elite, who are the ones in charge here, want to disempower. And if you look at the history of voter exclusion and suppression, they want to disempower. There are certain people they don't want to have the vote. Give them the power to vote. Right. Howard Zinn said, social change comes about when millions of people do small things, all in the same direction. And I think we have the potential to do that. I think we have the potential, and we were seeing it visualized in the Sanders campaign. And I have slight bias on that, but we've never seen a phenomenon like this with campaign finance of average of $17.
Yeah.
It's just phenomenal.
Right.
So.
We take donations.
Well,
we can help join it, yes.
I think that it's time for change, and the MAGA movement with Trump are people that don't want to change because by virtue of being white, male, capitalists, they were privileged. and the world isn't filled with white male happiness any longer. And that privilege is being questioned, challenged, and it will be overturned.
Yeah.
And I think this is a big backlash by the white male privileged
Yes.
folks
Yes.
to try to, as a last-ditch effort, to keep control.
I think you're right.
But, you know, the sexism, the capitalism, the inequities, the climate change, it's all bubbling for a perfect storm of change. And that's going to happen whether Trump's reelected, whether Pence comes into play, whatever. That change is in motion, and it's coming.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. We're running out of time. Let's have one more question.
Although that would be a nice one to end on, but go ahead.
And also to remind you that tonight at 7 o'clock at the library, Tim will be speaking about
voter exclusion and suppression, but we also want to do what we're doing right now.
which is have a discussion.
Have a discussion. So I'll outline a quick outline of the history and then open it up to, okay, where do we go from here? And that's what we would love to have good minds to that.
And then at the end, I have one more quote just to finish up. So,
Okay. One thing I think that is a big problem with middle-class Democrats is that the middle class has been so comfortable for so long that there is a kind of, we can think our way out of the box, but somebody else will fix it. And that doesn't happen.
So we've talked about personality and leadership today, but I want to finish with a quote from Ceylon to confound the issue. And this is a quote, this is a gentleman named Donald Trump, compared Tesla founder Elon Musk to inventor Thomas Edison in an interview on CNBC. And I'll quote you the interview, and then you can tell me what the diagnosis is. He's one of our great geniuses, and we have to protect our genius, Trump said. You know, we have to protect Thomas Edison, and we have to protect all the people that came up with originally the light bulb and the wheel and all of those things. And he's one of our very smart people, and we want to cherish those people. I spoke to him very recently, and Thomas said, no, I didn't. And I spoke to him very recently, and he's also doing the rockets. Rockets, R-O-C-K-E-T-S, not rockets. He likes rockets, and he does good at rockets too, by the way. I never saw where the engines come down with no wings, no anything, and they're landing, and I said, I've never seen that before, the president added. I'll leave you with that quote.
So uplifting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I came late and I didn't get any.
Absolutely.